The sharp sound of shattering glass broke the frozen silence of the winter night. Sadie leapt, her golden paws catching on the jagged edges of the broken window. Blood streaked the snow as she landed, her breaths ragged with fear. Behind her, the angry shouts of a man echoed in the distance, but Sadie didn't dare stop. This wasn't the life she had once known. How did it all go so terribly wrong? The house stood in utter ruin, a skeleton of what had once been a modest home. Its walls sagged inward as if burdened by years of neglect, and the faint glow of moonlight barely pierced the grime-coated windows. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of decay, a mixture of rotting garbage, mildew, and something far more insidious: despair. Sadie, a 4-year-old golden retriever, lay curled on the cold, dirty floor, her golden coat dulled by layers of filth. Her body was painfully thin, her ribs sharp against her skin, and her once bright brown eyes were dimmed by hunger and fear. She had lived in this house for years, a prisoner of cruelty, enduring the weight of Jacob's anger. The room around her was a chaotic sea of trash. Empty cans and broken glass were strewn about, mingled with scraps of food, too rancid even for the starving dog to stomach. A rusted iron chain dangled from the wall, a grim reminder of the countless nights Sadie had spent tethered, unable to move freely. Jacob was in the next room, his slurred voice carrying through the thin walls as he muttered to himself. The sound of a bottle clinking against the table made Sadie's ears twitch. She had learned to fear that sound. It often preceded his heavy footsteps, his drunken rage, and the unpredictable violence that followed. Tonight, however, the house was quiet, eerily so. Sadie's stomach growled loudly, breaking the silence. She hadn't eaten in days, and the ache was becoming unbearable. Her legs trembled as she pushed herself upright, her nose sniffing at the air. She moved cautiously, stepping over shards of glass and jagged pieces of wood, searching for anything that might ease her hunger. Sadie's movements brought her closer to the window, a small, cracked rectangle set high in the wall. The moonlight streaming through it cast a pale glow on the floor, and for the first time in a long while, Sadie felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten: hope. The window was her only escape. She had stared at it countless times, imagining the world beyond, the crisp air, the feel of snow under her paws, the freedom to run without chains. Tonight, something inside her snapped. She could no longer endure the filth, the hunger, the fear. She had to try. Her paws pressed against the wall, claws scraping as she tried to gain traction on the slippery surface. The effort was clumsy, and her weakened body struggled to lift itself. She slipped and fell, her legs buckling beneath her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Sadie gathered her remaining strength and leapt. Her paws struck the ledge of the window, and she scrambled desperately, ignoring the sharp edges of broken glass that cut into her pads. A small yelp escaped her as pain shot through her limbs, but she pushed forward, pulling her body through the narrow opening. As she forced her way out, shards of glass and bits of the rusted iron frame fell to the ground. One jagged piece sliced deep into her hind leg, drawing a crimson streak that stained her golden fur. Sadie didn't hesitate. With a final burst of effort, she leapt into the open air. She landed hard in the snow, the freezing cold biting into her wounds. The pristine white surface was quickly marred by splashes of red as blood dripped from her pores. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, visible in the icy night. Behind her, the house loomed like a dark, menacing shadow. From inside, Jacob's voice rose in a furious roar. He had heard the sound of shattering glass and the thud of Sadie's landing. His footsteps thundered through the house as he stumbled toward the door, his anger spilling into the cold night. "Sadie!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse and slurred. "Get back here!" Sadie's ears flattened against her head, but she didn't turn back. Her paws slipped on the icy surface as she broke into a run, her body protesting with every step. Each movement sent fresh pain shooting through her legs, but she refused to stop. Her survival depended on it. The world outside the house was vast and unfamiliar. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling her movements, and the frigid air stung her lungs. Every few steps, her legs threatened to give out, but she kept moving. Her mind focused on one thing: escape. Jacob's shouts grew louder as he emerged from the house, a flashlight in one hand and a length of rope in the other. He stumbled through the snow, his anger propelling him forward despite the cold. Sadie's trail of blood made her easy to track, and his figure loomed larger with every passing second. Sadie veered toward the trees, hoping the dense forest would shield her, but her strength was fading fast. The pain in her legs was unbearable, and her breaths came in shallow, desperate gasps. She stumbled and fell, her body collapsing into the snow. For a moment she tried to rise again, but her limbs refused to obey. Jacob's heavy boots crunched through the snow as he closed the distance. Sadie whimpered softly, her body trembling as his shadow fell over her. He reached down, grabbing her roughly by the scruff of her neck. "You thought you could run from me," he spat, his voice thick with anger and alcohol. "You're not going anywhere." Sadie didn't struggle. She didn't have the strength. As Jacob tied the rope around her neck and dragged her back toward the house, her heart sank. The taste of freedom had been so close, but it was gone now, swallowed by the darkness of the life she couldn't escape. Above them, the stars glittered coldly in the clear night sky, indifferent to the suffering below. Jacob hadn't always been the man he was now, a shadow of bitterness and rage. There was a time when he was kind and full of life, the type of man whose laughter filled a room and whose gentle touch brought comfort. Back then, Jacob lived a modest but happy life in a small house at the edge of town. His days were simple, spent working at his auto repair shop, a business he had built with his own hands. His evenings were filled with warmth. His wife, Mary, would cook dinner, while Sadie, a playful golden retriever pup, tugged at his shoelaces or chased the fading sunlight across their yard. Sadie had been a gift. Mary had surprised Jacob with her one summer evening, holding the tiny ball of golden fluff in her arms as she smiled at him. "You've always wanted a dog," she'd said, her voice full of excitement. "Now you have a partner to keep you company." Jacob had fallen in love instantly. Sadie became his constant companion, following him everywhere he went. At the shop, she would nap in the corner, her soft snores blending with the hum of machinery. At home, she would sit by his feet, tail wagging, as he read the evening paper. She was more than just a dog. She was a symbol of the life Jacob had always dreamed of, a life filled with love, stability, and purpose. But life has a way of unraveling even the strongest threads. The first blow came when Jacob's business began to falter. A larger auto repair chain opened in the center of town, offering cheaper prices and faster service. Customers who had once trusted Jacob with their cars began to trickle away, and no amount of discounts or friendly service could bring them back. The stress of dwindling income weighed heavily on Jacob. He tried to stay positive, working longer hours and cutting costs where he could, but the bills piled up faster than he could manage. Mary tried to support him, offering words of encouragement and taking on extra shifts at her job, but the cracks in their marriage began to show. Arguments became more frequent, and the laughter that once filled their home grew quieter with each passing day. The final blow came when the bank foreclosed on their home. Jacob was forced to close his shop, the business he had poured his heart into, and the house he and Mary had built their lives in was no longer theirs. Mary, worn down by the stress and heartbreak, packed her bags one night and left. She didn't say much as she walked out the door, only that she couldn't do it anymore. Jacob was left alone with nothing but the echo of his failures and the weight of his anger. In the aftermath of Mary's departure, Jacob turned to alcohol. At first, it was just a way to numb the pain, a drink or two in the evenings to quiet his racing thoughts. But the drinking quickly spiraled out of control. Days blurred into nights, and the man who once prided himself on his discipline and hard work became a shadow of himself. Sadie was still there, loyal as ever. She would sit by his side, her head resting on his lap, as if to remind him he wasn't truly alone. But Jacob, lost in his despair, began to see her not as a companion, but as a reminder of the life he had lost. The sight of her wagging tail, the sound of her playful bark, they only deepened his anger, a cruel reminder of the happiness he believed he no longer deserved. One evening, in a drunken stupor, Jacob lashed out. Sadie had nudged his hand, her way of asking for attention, but instead of the affectionate pat she had once received, she was met with a harsh shove. She yelped, startled, but stayed close, her eyes wide with confusion. Over time, the shoves became kicks, the harsh words turned to shouts, and the man who had once adored her became a source of fear. Sadie didn't understand what she had done wrong. She didn't know why the man who once scratched behind her ears and played fetch with her now left her chained in the corner, ignored and forgotten. But she stayed, as dogs often do, her loyalty unwavering, even in the face of cruelty. Jacob's treatment of Sadie worsened as the years went on. His anger, fueled by alcohol and self-loathing, had no outlet but her. He saw her as a burden, a reminder of the life he had lost, and the man he could no longer be. He stopped feeding her regularly, letting her scavenge for scraps among the trash that littered their home. Her once lustrous coat became matted and dirty, and her body grew thin from hunger. But in rare moments of clarity, when the haze of alcohol lifted, Jacob would stare at Sadie and feel a pang of guilt. He would remember the puppy Mary had brought home, the joy she had brought to their lives, and the man he had been. In those moments, he wanted to be better. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to show her that the man she had loved was still there, somewhere deep inside. But the guilt was fleeting, quickly drowned by another bottle, and so Sadie remained a prisoner, not just of Jacob's house, but of his pain, his anger, and his inability to let go of the past. As Jacob sat in the dim light of his crumbling home, bottle in hand, Sadie lay nearby, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she had learned not to hope for better. Jacob didn't know it either, but deep down, a part of him feared the same, that he was beyond saving, and that the only thing left for either of them was more darkness. In the silence, broken only by the sound of his uneven breaths, Jacob muttered to himself, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he whispered, though Sadie was the only one there to hear him. Her ears twitched, but she didn't move. It was a moment of vulnerability, a crack in the hardened shell he had built around himself. But like all moments, it passed, leaving only the cold, hard truth of the life they now shared. A life neither of them wanted, but both were trapped in. Charlotte pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as the cold wind whipped through the quiet streets of the small town. She had just finished her evening shift at the clinic and was heading home when she heard it, a faint, pitiful sound that cut through the icy air. It was a bark, weak and tremulous, barely audible over the howling wind. She stopped in her tracks, her breath visible in the freezing night, and strained to listen. There it was again, softer this time but unmistakable. Her heart clenched. It was coming from the direction of the old house on the edge of town, a place long abandoned and rumored to be in ruins. Without hesitation, Charlotte turned and made her way towards the sound, her boots crunching against the snow. The house loomed before her like a spectre, its windows dark and shattered, the roof caving in at the corners. As she approached, the faint barking grew louder, tinged with desperation. Charlotte pushed open the rusted gate, the creak echoing eerily in the stillness. She hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the porch, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of life. Inside, the stench hit her like a physical blow. It was a nauseating mix of rotting garbage, mildew, and something far worse. She covered her nose with her sleeve, her stomach churning, and stepped carefully over the debris that littered the floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady but cautious. The bark came again, this time from the corner of the room. Charlotte's gaze followed the sound, and her breath caught in her throat. There, lying amidst the filth, was Sadie. The golden retriever was curled tightly into herself, her body thin and frail, her once golden coat matted and dull. Blood stained her pores, and her eyes, dark and sunken, met Charlotte's with a mixture of fear and despair. The sight was almost too much to bear. "Oh, my God," Charlotte whispered, kneeling down. She extended her hand slowly, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey there, sweet girl, it's okay. I'm here to help." Sadie flinched at first, her body trembling, but something in Charlotte's voice seemed to cut through her fear. She didn't move closer, but she didn't back away either. Charlotte's heart broke at the sight of the dog's gaunt frame and the raw wounds on her paws. Determined to help, Charlotte pulled out her phone and called the local police. Her voice was firm as she explained the situation, urging them to send help immediately. As she ended the call, the sound of heavy footsteps startled her. She turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway, his face twisted in anger. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he growled, his voice slurred from alcohol. Charlotte stood her ground, her expression unwavering. "This dog needs help," she said, her tone steady. "She's starving and injured. I'm taking her out of here." Jacob staggered forward, his fists clenched. "That's my dog. You have no right to take her," he shouted, his face reddening with rage. Charlotte's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "She's dying in here," she said, her voice rising. "You've done enough damage. I'm not leaving without her." Jacob lunged toward her, but the sound of sirens in the distance froze him in his tracks. His eyes darted toward the door, his anger giving way to panic. "You called the cops," he spat, his voice trembling. Charlotte didn't answer. She kept her eyes on Sadie, who was now whimpering softly, her body pressing closer to the wall as if trying to disappear. The police arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Jacob cursed under his breath, his bravado crumbling as the officers stepped inside. "This is my property," he shouted, but his protests were weak, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt and fear. One of the officers approached him, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "Sir, step outside. Now." Jacob hesitated, his gaze shifting between Charlotte and the officers. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he turned and stumbled out the door, disappearing into the night. Charlotte wasted no time. She wrapped Sadie in her coat, cradling the trembling dog against her chest. "It's okay now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe." The ride to the rescue shelter was quiet, the only sound the hum of the car engine and Sadie's shallow breaths. Charlotte kept one hand on the steering wheel, and the other gently stroking Sadie's head, offering whatever comfort she could. The dog's body was limp, her exhaustion overwhelming, but Charlotte could feel the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. When they arrived, the staff at the shelter sprang into action. A veterinarian examined Sadie, her skilled hands moving quickly but gently as she assessed the dog's injuries. Charlotte stood nearby, her heart in her throat as she watched. "She's in bad shape," the vet said finally, her voice grim. "Malnourished, dehydrated, and those wounds on her paws are infected. But with the right care, she'll recover." Charlotte exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knelt beside Sadie, who was now lying on a soft blanket, her eyes half closed. "You're going to be okay," she murmured. "You're safe now." As the night wore on, Charlotte stayed by Sadie's side, refusing to leave until she was sure the dog was stable. The shelter staff assured her that they would do everything they could to nurse Sadie back to health, but Charlotte couldn't shake the image of the dog cowering in that filthy house. Sadie had been through so much, too much, but Charlotte was determined to give her a chance at a better life. She didn't know what the future held for the dog, but she knew one thing for certain. Sadie would never have to face that kind of darkness again. And for the first time in a long while, Sadie's eyes, though tired and heavy, held a flicker of hope. The rescue shelter was a warm haven compared to the cold, decrepit house where Sadie had spent so many years. Its clean, well-lit corridors were filled with the gentle hum of activity, soft voices of caregivers, the occasional bark or purr of rescued animals, and the steady rhythm of hope. But for Sadie, this new environment was both strange and overwhelming. She lay on a thick blanket in one of the shelter's quiet recovery rooms, her golden coat freshly washed, but still dull and thin. Her wounds, cleaned and dressed, throbbed faintly with every small movement. Sadie's large brown eyes darted nervously around the room, tracking every shadow and sound. Despite the soft voices of reassurance and the warmth of the space, her body remained tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Dr. Harper, the shelter's veterinarian, leaned down to examine Sadie. The woman's movements were careful and deliberate, her voice low and soothing. "You're safe here, sweet girl," she murmured, as she gently removed the bandages from Sadie's paws. The deep cuts caused by the broken glass had started to scab over, but infection had set in, making the healing process slower than expected. Charlotte stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched as Dr. Harper cleaned the wounds with saline, her experienced hands working quickly to minimize Sadie's discomfort. Sadie flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away entirely. A small victory in the battle against her fear. "She's malnourished and dehydrated," Dr. Harper said, her tone serious but calm. "Her physical wounds will heal, but—" She paused, glancing at Charlotte. "The psychological scars will take much longer. She's been through a lot." Charlotte nodded, her gaze fixed on Sadie. "What can we do for her?" she asked softly. "Patience," Dr. Harper replied. "She needs to feel safe, and that won't happen overnight, but with time and love she'll come around." As days turned into weeks, Sadie's physical wounds began to heal. Her bandages were changed regularly, and she started eating small, carefully prepared meals. Slowly, her body regained some strength, but her mind remained fragile. Every time someone entered her recovery room, Sadie would shrink back into the corner, her ears flattened against her head. Her eyes, once filled with boundless trust, now held only fear. The sound of footsteps or the rustling of clothing made her flinch, and any sudden movement sent her trembling. The shelter staff did their best to move slowly and speak softly around her, but they knew progress would be slow. For Sadie, every human hand was a potential threat, every kind word a trap. The years of neglect and cruelty had taught her to trust nothing and no one. Charlotte, however, refused to give up. She visited the shelter every day after her shifts at the clinic, spending hours sitting quietly in Sadie's room. She would bring books or paperwork to occupy herself, speaking softly to Sadie whenever the dog's wary eyes met hers. At first, Sadie didn't respond. She stayed curled in her corner, watching Charlotte with suspicion. But Charlotte was patient. She understood that rebuilding trust wasn't something that could be rushed. Each day, she inched a little closer, never pushing, always waiting for Sadie to make the first move. One day, while Charlotte was reading aloud from a book, Sadie took a tentative step forward. It was small, barely a shift in her position, but it was the first time she had moved towards someone instead of away. Charlotte's heart swelled with hope, but she didn't react too strongly. Instead, she continued reading, her voice steady and calm. The true breakthrough came a few weeks later. Charlotte had brought a soft fleece blanket and laid it on the floor near Sadie's usual spot. She sat down cross-legged, holding a small piece of cooked chicken in her hand. She didn't call to Sadie or try to coax her. She simply waited. Sadie's nose twitched as the scent of the chicken reached her. Her body remained tense, but hunger slowly outweighed her fear. She took a cautious step forward, then another. Her eyes stayed locked on Charlotte's hand, watching for any sudden movements. When she finally reached the chicken, she snatched it quickly, retreating a few steps to eat it. Charlotte stayed still, her heart pounding with quiet triumph. "Good girl, Sadie," she said softly. You're so brave." The routine continued over the following days. Each time, Sadie moved a little closer, her tail giving the faintest wag when Charlotte praised her. By the end of the week, Sadie allowed Charlotte to gently stroke her head, though her body remained stiff and uncertain. One evening, as Charlotte sat with Sadie, the dog did something that brought tears to her eyes. After eating her small treat, Sadie didn't retreat to her corner. Instead, she stayed where she was, her eyes meeting Charlotte's with something new, a flicker of trust. Sadie took a step closer, then another, until her head rested tentatively on Charlotte's knee. For a moment, neither of them moved. Charlotte's hand hovered in the air before she slowly lowered it, gently running her fingers through Sadie's fur. The dog's body relaxed slightly, and for the first time, Sadie let out a soft sigh of contentment. "You're going to be okay, sweet girl," Charlotte whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." Sadie's journey was far from over, but the progress she had made was undeniable. She no longer cowered at every sound, and her eyes, though still cautious, held a glimmer of hope. The shelter staff marveled at the transformation, crediting Charlotte's patience and unwavering love. For Charlotte, the bond she was building with Sadie was more than just a mission. It was a promise to give this dog a life free from fear and pain. Sadie had been broken, but she wasn't beyond repair, and for the first time in years, she was beginning to believe that herself. Sadie's transformation was slow but steady. Her wounds had healed, and the once gaunt and malnourished golden retriever now stood with a regal grace. Her golden coat shimmered in the sunlight that streamed through the shelter windows, a testament to the care she had received. But while her body had recovered, her mind remained a labyrinth of fear and mistrust. Each day brought signs of progress. Sadie no longer flinched at every sound, and she had begun to wag her tail, though cautiously, when familiar faces approached. But the shadows of her past still lingered, clouding her ability to trust strangers. The staff at the shelter agreed it was time to find her a permanent home, a loving family who could continue the work Charlotte had started. The first family arrived on a chilly autumn morning. A couple with 2 young children had seen Sadie's picture on the shelter's website and fallen in love with her gentle eyes and golden coat. The children's excitement was palpable as they approached her enclosure, their small hands pressed against the glass. "She's beautiful," the mother whispered, her eyes soft with affection. Charlotte, standing nearby, watched nervously as the staff led Sadie into the interaction room. The children squealed with delight, but the noise made Sadie freeze. Her tail tucked tightly between her legs and her body pressed against the far wall. When the children stepped closer, Sadie let out a low, warning growl. Not out of aggression, but fear. The father pulled the children back, his expression tense. "Maybe she's not used to kids," he said, his voice gentle but firm. The family left soon after, their excitement dimmed by Sadie's reaction. Charlotte sighed, her heart heavy. "She's not ready," she murmured to herself. "Not yet." A week later, a single woman named Karen arrived. She was quiet and soft-spoken, her demeanor calm as she explained her desire to adopt a companion. She had no children, no other pets, and a spacious home with a large yard, an ideal environment for a dog like Sadie. The initial meeting was promising. Karen sat on the floor speaking to Sadie in soothing tones and offering treats. Sadie sniffed cautiously, her tail wagging faintly. For a moment, it seemed like this might be the right match. But when Karen stood to reach for her bag, the sudden movement startled Sadie. The dog barked loudly, retreating to the corner of the room. Her body trembled as her eyes darted toward the door, her instincts screaming for escape. Karen tried to reassure her, but Sadie wouldn't come near again. Disheartened, Karen left, her kind smile tinged with disappointment. "She's a beautiful dog," she said to Charlotte before leaving. "I hope she finds what she needs." Over the next month, more families came and went. each one left with the same regretful look, their hopes dashed by Sadie's inability to connect. She would bark loudly at the sight of strangers or cower in fear, her body language clear. She wasn't ready to trust. The shelter staff began to worry. "She's been through too much," one of them said. "Maybe she's not meant to be adopted." Charlotte refused to accept that. She visited Sadie every day, spending hours sitting with her and reminding her she wasn't alone. Sadie's bond with Charlotte only deepened during this time, but it also became clear that Charlotte was the only person Sadie truly trusted. One evening, as Charlotte sat beside Sadie in the shelter's outdoor pen, she watched the dog sniff the cool autumn air. The soft rustle of leaves in the wind seemed to calm her, and Charlotte couldn't help but smile. But the question that had been weighing on her mind for weeks now grew louder. What if no one else can give her what she needs? "Maybe you're waiting for the right family," Charlotte said aloud, her voice soft. "Or maybe—" She trailed off, the unspoken thought lingering in the air. Sadie glanced at her, her brown eyes steady and filled with the trust they had spent months rebuilding. A few days later, another family arrived. They were kind and patient, speaking softly and moving slowly to avoid startling Sadie. She seemed calmer this time, even sniffing their hands when they offered treats. Charlotte watched from the corner of the room, her heart hopeful. But when the family reached out to pet her, Sadie recoiled. Her bark was sharp and loud, echoing through the room. The family hesitated, their smiles faltering. They left soon after, their disappointment evident. Charlotte knelt beside Sadie, who had retreated to her usual corner. "You're not ready, are you?" she said, stroking Sadie's head gently. "You've been through so much. I don't blame you." Sadie rested her head on Charlotte's lap, her body relaxing for the first time that day. In that moment, it was clear. Sadie had already made her choice. She had chosen Charlotte, the one person who had stood by her through every step of her recovery. The shelter director approached Charlotte later that week. "We've been talking," she said. "It's clear Sadie has bonded with you more than anyone else. Maybe she's not looking for just any family. Maybe she's looking for you." Charlotte's breath caught. She had avoided the thought, convincing herself that someone else might be better equipped to give Sadie the life she deserved. But now, as she looked into Sadie's trusting eyes, she realized the truth. Sadie didn't need a perfect family. She needed someone who understood her fears, who could give her the time and patience she needed to heal, and that person had been there all along. Charlotte knelt down and hugged Sadie tightly. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "You're home now." The morning air was crisp and filled with the promise of new beginnings as Charlotte walked through the familiar doors of the shelter. She carried a bag of Sadie's favorite treats, ready for their usual visit. But as she stepped into the recovery room, something unexpected happened. Sadie, who normally waited in her corner for Charlotte to approach, stood and walked toward her. Her steps were steady but deliberate, and her tail wagged gently. When their eyes met, Sadie's expression was unmistakable, an unspoken message of trust and affection. For the first time, there was no hesitation, no fear. Sadie had chosen her. Charlotte knelt down, her heart swelling as Sadie pressed her head against her chest. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "You're ready, aren't you?" She knew in that moment that she couldn't leave Sadie behind. The bond they had built was unshakable. Sadie had finally found her person, and Charlotte knew she had found her dog. The drive to Charlotte's house was quiet, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to the emotions swirling in the car. Sadie sat in the back seat, her body relaxed in a way Charlotte had never seen before. The windows were cracked open, and Sadie's nose twitched at the cool autumn breeze. It was as if she knew she was leaving the shadows of her past behind. When they arrived, Charlotte led Sadie into the house. The space was warm and inviting, filled with soft furniture and sunlight streaming through the windows. A plush dog bed sat in the corner, waiting just for her. Sadie sniffed cautiously at first, exploring the rooms with tentative steps, but soon she began to relax, her tail wagging as she settled onto the bed. "This is your home now," Charlotte said softly, sitting down beside her. "No more fear, no more pain, just love." The days that followed were filled with small victories. Sadie, once too timid to even leave a corner, now roamed the house freely. She discovered the joys of napping in patches of sunlight, chasing squirrels in the backyard, and curling up at Charlotte's feet in the evenings. Each day she seemed to shed another layer of her past, her spirit growing brighter. Charlotte made it a point to take Sadie on long walks through the nearby park. At first, Sadie was cautious, her ears perked and her steps slow. But as the weeks went by, she began to enjoy the sights and sounds of the world around her. The rustle of leaves, the laughter of children, the smell of fresh grass. It was all new to her, and she embraced it with a quiet curiosity. Despite the progress, there were still moments when the past crept in. A loud noise or a sudden movement would cause Sadie to flinch, her body tensing as old fears resurfaced. But Charlotte was always there, her soothing voice and gentle touch reminding Sadie that she was safe. One evening, as Charlotte prepared dinner, a pan clattered to the floor. Sadie froze, her tail tucking between her legs as she backed into a corner. Charlotte immediately knelt beside her, speaking softly. "It's okay, sweet girl. Nothing will hurt you here." It took a few minutes, but Sadie slowly stepped forward, leaning into Charlotte's hand. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Months passed, and Sadie blossomed into the dog she was always meant to be. Her golden coat regained its luster, and her once cautious eyes now sparkled with life. Charlotte couldn't imagine her home without Sadie. The bond they shared was unbreakable, forged through patience, love, and trust. One chilly evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Charlotte and Sadie sat together on the couch. Sadie's head rested on Charlotte's lap, her body warm and relaxed. Charlotte stroked her fur, her heart full of gratitude for the journey they had taken together. "You've come so far," Charlotte whispered, "and I'm so proud of you." Sadie let out a contented sigh, her tail wagging softly. For the first time in years, she was at peace. Sadie's story was one of resilience, of overcoming the darkest of circumstances to find light. She had been broken, but not defeated, and with Charlotte's love, she had found the strength to heal. Their home was not just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where Sadie could finally be herself. And as they sat together, watching the snow fall outside, one thing was certain. Sadie was no longer just surviving. She was living, surrounded by love, and ready to embrace the happiness she had always deserved. Sadie's journey reminds us of the incredible resilience that lives within every soul, even those that have endured unimaginable pain. She taught us that healing takes time, trust can be rebuilt, and love has the power to transform even the darkest of pasts. From a frightened, broken dog to a cherished member of a family, Sadie's story is a testament to the miracles that compassion and patience can create. Let us carry this lesson with us. No matter how bleak the circumstances, there is always hope, and there is always room for a second chance. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may stories like Sadie's inspire us all to appreciate the beauty of kindness and the strength of the bonds we share. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear about your experiences with love and resilience. Together we can spread hope and compassion to those who need it most.